Endo means inside, and endocrine glands release their product directly into the blood, that is, directly into the systemic circulation. These glands have no ducts, and for this reason in the past they were sometimes called ductless glands. So endocrine products are released directly into the blood. They have no ducts like exocrine glands have ducts. The product is released directly into the blood, which is circulating through the gland at the time. And this means that endocrine products are rapidly, systemically distributed throughout the entire bloodstream. And endocrine products are referred to as hormones. And a hormone is a chemical messenger which circulates in the blood, albeit at low concentrations. And after being produced in an endocrine gland, a hormone circulates into the blood until it reaches a specific target tissue. So endocrine products, as we see in this diagram, are released directly into the blood. So what we see on the left here is we see some cuboidal endocrine cells. They are secretory. The endocrine hormone is synthesized in the endocrine cells, which will be part of an endocrine gland, and then the product is exported directly into the systemic circulation. After being produced in an endocrine gland, the endocrine hormone circulates in the blood and tissue fluids until it reaches a specific target tissue or target cell, or to be more precise, a target receptor site or target receptor molecule. And the hormone will then bind onto a specific receptor on or in the target cells in the target tissue. And it's the combination of a hormone and the receptor site which then initiate a physiological response in the target cell. So what we see here is we see some molecules of endocrine hormone, which in this case are square, and they try to get into this semicircular hole in the first cell, and of course they can't fit in. You won't get binding of the signal molecule and the receptor. Then they try to get into another cell where the receptor sites are oblong, and again they won't fit. So this particular hormone is not capable of initiating a response in this second cell. However, when it comes to the third cell, the square molecules of endocrine hormone in this case are able to fit into the specifically designed square receptor sites. And once there's a combination of the endocrine hormone and the receptor site, this will generate secondary changes within the cell, bringing about a physiological response in that cell. But it takes both. It takes the signal molecule, which is the endocrine hormone, and it takes the receptor. One on its own will not give a physiological response. We could indeed say that it takes two to tango. Because a hormone carries a chemical message, it's sometimes referred to as a signal. And a signal molecule has a particular shape and defined chemical properties. This means the signal will only bind to a specific receptor site. And receptor sites are made of protein, and they are located in or on the target cells. So in this sense, the hormone is analogous to a key, and the receptor would be the lock. And a specific key is required to open a particular specific lock. And the cells which comprise the tissues of the body have many receptor sites on internal and external cell surfaces. However, only the signal with the correctly shaped key can activate a specific receptor site. Now, a target cell may have several thousand receptor sites for a particular hormone on its external cell membranes, and indeed sometimes on its internal surfaces. And signal molecules are also sometimes referred to as ligands or ligands, depending on how you would like to pronounce it. So the ligand or the ligand is the signal molecule that fits into the specific receptor site. Here we've identified the anatomical locations of some of the principal endocrine glands. So starting from the top, we have the pineal gland and then the hypothalamus. Below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. In the neck, we have the thyroid gland, looking a little bit like a bow tie. And embedded within the tissue of the thyroid gland, we have the parathyroid glands. The thymus gland is in the chest, and the adrenal glands that used to be called the suprarenal glands are above the kidneys, and indeed the kidneys themselves, in addition to their many other functions, also have endocrine functions. Within the pancreas are embedded the pancreatic islets, formerly called the pancreatic islets of Langerhans, which are the endocrine tissues in the pancreas. And then there are the gonads, the ovaries in females, and the testes in males. Well, here we have a post-mortem section of the brain. Going from the left, you can probably see the top of the spinal cord merging in with the brain stem. On top of that, you can probably see the cerebellum. You can see the convoluted cerebrum. And this stick is actually pointing to the thalamus. And below the thalamus, the area below the thalamus, logically enough, is called the hypothalamus. And below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland sitting there at the base of the brain. This plastic model also helps us to visualize the location of the pituitary gland. It's number 11 on this model, and it's that little orangey pea-sized structure located at the base of the brain. And you can probably see it's located in a dip that's made specially for it in the floor of the skull, called the pituitary fossa. Well, here we're looking at a picture of the floor of the skull, and at the bottom of the picture you can see the large hole called the foramen magnum. And the foramen magnum is where the spinal cord communicates with the brain through the floor or the base of the skull. Nerve fibers going in and out through the foramen magnum. And above that you can see a ridge of bone, and then I think you can probably see an indented small fossa. There's actually a blue smudge on this skull that shouldn't really be there, but the pituitary fossa is just below the blue smudge, and in life the pituitary gland sits in that small pituitary fossa at the base of the brain on the basal surface of the skull. The scientifically correct name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. Now the anterior lobe, that is the front lobe, is called the adenohypophysis because it's composed of glandular tissue. Adenohypophysis, adeno means glandular or to do with glandular tissue. And because the posterior lobe is made of nervous tissue, it's not made of glandular tissue. Because it's made of nervous tissue, it's termed the neurohypophysis. So the hypophysis has an anterior lobe, which is the adenohypophysis, and a posterior lobe, which is the neurohypophysis. The pituitary gland is actually really quite small. It's only about the size of a pea, about 1 to 1.5 centimeters in diameter. And as we've seen, it sits snugly in the pituitary fossa, which is the bony depression in the base of the skull. And the gland is attached to the base of the brain by a stalk underneath the hypothalamus. And as we see from this diagram, the pituitary gland is composed of two side-by-side, two adjacent but separate lobes. The larger anterior lobe at the front is composed of glandular tissue. Anterior glandular tissue in the front lobe of the pituitary gland produces hormones and releases these directly into the systemic circulation. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is actually made of neurological tissue, and hormones released from this lobe are actually produced in cell bodies located in the hypothalamus. Once they've been synthesized, these hormones are packaged into granules, which then travel or migrate down these long secretory axons before being released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And because posterior lobe hormones are produced in the nerve cells, the process is termed neurosecretion. So here we can see in this diagram that there are cell bodies of secretory neurons in the hypothalamus. The axons of these cell bodies pass down the pituitary stalk, and the hormones are actually released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. This slide is actually relatively low magnification. It's just 100 times magnification. And even although the two lobes of the pituitary gland are sitting there side by side, we can see that they're made up of completely different tissues. The anterior lobe, the front lobe, is the adenohypophysis, and we can see that that's made of glandular secretory tissue. However, the lobe at the back, the posterior lobe, which is the neurohypophysis, is made up of neurological tissue, the end of the axons which have projected down from the hypothalamus. So in the posterior lobe, we are seeing the neurosecretory axons, two completely different types of tissue, albeit anatomically located so closely side by side. Well, as we see, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is only producing two hormones, oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Now, oxytocin has got two main functions. Release of this hormone oxytocin may be stimulated by distension of the uterus in the later stages of pregnancy, and the oxytocin then stimulates the contraction of the uterine muscle during childbirth, during the process of delivery. And this explains why oxytocin may be used clinically to induce labour. And the second role of oxytocin is during lactation. When a baby suckles at the nipple, this stimulates a reflex which leads to oxytocin release. And in this case, the oxytocin contracts the milk ducts to stimulate the release of the milk from the nipple in the process of milk letdown. So we sometimes say that oxytocin stimulates milk letdown, the actual secretion of milk from the nipple on the breast. So in both cases, oxytocin is working by stimulating smooth muscle contraction. Firstly, in the uterus during delivery, and secondly, in the walls of the milk ducts in suckling during lactation. But of course, it's way more complicated than this. There's lots more functions of oxytocin have been discovered recently, particularly related to feelings of emotion, love, and bonding. So the oxytocin is very important in forming bonds between the mother and the baby. And indeed, oxytocin is probably involved in intimate bond formation between humans at different phases of life, as well as during birth and lactation. So it's a little crude to generalize in this way, but we could say that oxytocin is responsible for many feelings of love, commitment, and long-term bonding between people. Now, I think you probably all know what a diuretic drug does. Diuretic promotes diuresis, and a diuresis means a large volume of urine. So a diuretic is a drug which will increase urine volumes, and of course clinically this is often a very useful and helpful thing for us to be able to do. The converse of a diuretic is an antidiuretic. So if a diuretic increases urine volumes, the presence of an antidiuretic will reduce urine volumes. So the more antidiuretic hormone we have in the circulation, the lower the volumes of urine that will be produced. It's an antidiuretic. ACTH is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and this is produced by the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate the adrenal cortex. So if you think about the word adrenocorticotropic, adreno means adrenal glands, cortico means this affects the cortex, that is the outer part of the adrenal gland, and it's a trophic hormone, therefore it has an effect on this structure. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. So this stimulates the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex, both hydrocortisone, sometimes called cortisol, and another one called corticosterone. And these are steroid type hormones, which are collectively called the glucocorticoids. And ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, also stimulates the release of androgens. An androgen is a male type hormone. So the ACTH also stimulates the release of androgens from the adrenal cortex. And levels of these adrenal cortical hormones are detected by specialized cells in the hypothalamus in a similar way to the levels of thyroid hormone we've already discussed. Now FSH stands for the follicle stimulating hormone. And FSH is particularly interesting as it has different functions in men and women. In men, FSH stimulates the production of sperm in the testes in the process of what is called spermatogenesis. So FSH is stimulating spermatogenesis. And the word genesis refers to beginning. So spermatogenesis is literally means the beginning of sperm. Now in women, FSH has two functions. Firstly, it stimulates the development of the ova each month in the ovaries. The structure within the ovary containing an ovum is called the follicle, and this is where FSH gets its name. So this hormone was discovered first in women, and then it was realized it had functions in men. So remember, the structure within an ovary containing an ovum is called the follicle, and FSH stimulates the development of that follicle. And an ovum, as you probably know, is a female gamete, that is an egg cell, which can be fertilized by the sperm. And secondly, FSH stimulates the ovaries to release the female hormone estrogen. So FSH in women is doing two things. It's stimulating the development of the ova each month as it stimulates the development of the follicle. And secondly, it's stimulating the ovaries to release the female hormone estrogen. The luteinizing hormone, LH, again produced by the anterior pituitary, has different functions in men and women. And again, this one was discovered first in women, which is where it gets its name. So in women, LH, luteinizing hormone, stimulates the ovary to release the ovum. It's what actually triggers ovulation, normally around day 14 of the menstrual cycle. And the luteinizing hormone also regulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is what the follicle becomes after ovulation has occurred. So the luteinizing hormone also regulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum during the second half of the menstrual cycle. And this is, of course, essential to maintain the endometrium in case fertilization occurs, so that if fertilization occurs, the endometrium is maintained to receive the fertilized ovum. In men, luteinizing hormone stimulates the endocrine tissues in the testes to produce the male hormone testosterone. So in men, the luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the production of testosterone. Prolactin acts on the breasts to initiate and stimulate the synthesis of milk. It sustains the synthesis of milk. And this process of the synthesis of milk is called lactation. Lact means to do with milk. For example, you know that lactose is the sugar found in milk. Now, the action of prolactin should not be confused with that of oxytocin. It's prolactin that stimulates the actual synthesis of milk, whereas the oxytocin stimulates the ejection of the produced milk from the breasts. In men, prolactin actually reduces blood levels of testosterone, and at a high level it may inhibit sperm production in men as well. Thyroid stimulating hormone produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland will stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone. But if you keep going with this PowerPoint, there's some more information on that shortly. Growth hormone is also sometimes referred to as somatotrophin. Somato or soma mean to do with the body, and it is the action of growth hormone which causes children to grow. If not enough growth hormone is produced in childhood, then dwarfism will result. But there again, if too much growth hormone is produced during childhood, then a giant or giantism will be caused. So the hypothalamus is able to detect the osmolarity of the blood which is passing through the hypothalamus. Now, if there's an increased osmolarity of the blood, does that mean there's more or less water in the blood? Well, if the osmolarity is increased, this means that there's a greater concentration of solutes in the blood because there is less water. So an increased osmolarity indicates that there is less water in the blood. Now, if there's less water in the blood, we don't want to be excreting water, we want to be retaining it. So when there's reduced amounts of water, that's going to increase the osmolarity of the blood. Therefore, the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, is going to respond by producing more antidiuretic hormone. So less water in the blood means that the pituitary gland will secrete more antidiuretic hormone. And the more antidiuretic hormone, the more the kidneys will retain water. Therefore, the urine volumes will be reduced. So the more antidiuretic hormone, the lower the volumes of urine. That's good because it means that the water that we already have in the body is retained. So we will reduce the increase in osmolarity. The osmolarity won't be increased by excessive secretion of water or excretion of water by the kidneys. So increased osmolarity means less water. That results in more antidiuretic hormone. That results in lower volumes of urine. Therefore, water is retained in the body. If there is decreased osmolarity in the plasma, that will also be detected by the hypothalamus. Now, if there's decreased osmolarity, does that mean there's more or less water in the blood? Well, if the osmolarity is decreased, that's because the solutes are being diluted by increased amounts of water. So if we drink a lot, the osmolarity of the plasma will be decreased. Now, in this case, if there's too much water in the blood, the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, will respond by producing less antidiuretic hormone. And if there's less antidiuretic hormone, this kind of takes the brakes off the kidney and it frees the kidney to excrete much larger volumes of water. So the kidney will produce larger volumes of dilute urine. Left to its own devices, the kidney will produce about 20 litres of urine per day, unless it's inhibited by the antidiuretic hormone. So when you drink too much, there's less antidiuretic hormone. That means there's less antidiuretic effect. That means there's a greater diuresis. Larger volumes of urine will be produced. That means that the excess water can be excreted from the blood, and that will restore the osmolarity of the plasma to homeostatic levels. There will be a relative increase in the osmolarity of the plasma because the excess water will have been excreted from the body in the urine. Traditionally, the pituitary gland has been described as the master gland, or the conductor or leader of the endocrine orchestra. And this is because the anterior lobe produces trophic hormones. And it's these trophic hormones produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland which coordinate the activity of the other endocrine glands. And while this is true, the anterior pituitary gland itself is actually regulated by the hypothalamus. This part of the brain, the hypothalamus, produces a range of hormones which act on the anterior pituitary. So in this sense, the hypothalamus has an endocrine function, and in this sense, the hypothalamus could justifiably be referred to as the leader or the conductor of the endocrine orchestra. So the hypothalamus regulates anterior pituitary function by producing a range of neurohormones which regulate the release of the trophic hormones. And remember, it's the trophic hormones produced by the pituitary gland itself, by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which regulate the activity of all the individual endocrine glands. So the neurohormones produced by the hypothalamus are also called releasing hormones, as their function is usually to stimulate the release of the trophic hormones. Now, these hypothalamic releasing hormones are actually produced in very small amounts, and they're produced by the hypothalamus. Now, normally an endocrine hormone is secreted directly into the systemic blood circulation, but this is not the case with the hypothalamic releasing hormones. What happens here is that the releasing hormones, which regulate the release of the trophic hormones from the anterior pituitary, these releasing hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, and they are absorbed into capillaries going through the hypothalamus. But these capillaries do not drain directly into the systemic venous circulation. They actually drain directly into specialized veins called portal veins. And a portal vein is a vein which begins and ends with capillaries. So these releasing products, these releasing hormones, go into the capillaries in the hypothalamus, and they go into the portal veins, and this delivers them at relatively high concentrations directly to the anterior pituitary gland. This means that these releasing hormones can be produced efficiently in very small amounts by the hypothalamus, because they don't have to be diluted in the whole blood, in the whole systemic circulation. So they pass directly in these portal veins to the pituitary gland, where they will then stimulate the release of just the right amounts of the trophic hormones. So this is an example of what we call a portal system. A portal system begins and ends in capillaries. This one begins in the capillaries of the hypothalamus and ends in the capillaries of the anterior pituitary gland. Only then does the blood drain back into the systemic venous circulation. And you can probably think of the other example of a portal system in the body. Have you remembered that one? The other example is the hepatic portal vein, where the blood absorbed from the gut goes via the hepatic portal vein directly to the liver. I think we'll just give a few examples of these releasing hormones to illustrate what's going on. So hypothalamic neurohormones include the growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, and this stimulates the anterior pituitary cells called somatotrophs to release growth hormone into the blood. So it's the growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates the somatotrophs in the anterior pituitary to produce more growth hormone, bringing about growth during childhood. Thyrotrophin releasing hormone, TRH, thyrotrophin releasing hormone, stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And the thyroid stimulating hormone is produced by a group of specialized anterior pituitary cells called thyrotrophs. Corticotrophin releasing hormone, CRH, corticotrophin releasing hormone, causes the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland, to release adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. And the adrenocorticotrophic hormone is produced by specialized pituitary cells called cortotrophs. So what we see is that the releasing hormones stimulate specific secretory cells in the anterior pituitary to produce the specific trophic hormone required in just the right amounts. And of course, all this is going on simultaneously. So histologically, we see that the anterior pituitary gland is a very complicated structure containing specialized cells to produce the specific trophic hormones under the influence of the specific releasing hormones, which are in turn produced by the hypothalamus. It's absolutely vital that the level of hormones in the blood are at just the right homeostatic concentrations. We don't want too much of a hormone, and we certainly don't want not enough of a hormone. So here we see the example of the thyroid hormone. We want just the right amount of thyroid hormone. Too much thyroid hormone would cause hyperthyroidism, sometimes referred to as thyrotoxicosis, and this is obviously a pathological condition. But conversely, we don't want not enough of the thyroid hormone. That would cause a condition called hypothyroidism, and again, this is a pathological condition. It's vital we have just the right amount of thyroid hormone in the blood. Not too much, not too little. Now the hypothalamus is able to detect the concentrations of the thyroid hormone in the blood that is passing through the hypothalamus. And if the levels of thyroid hormone in the blood are reduced, that is, if there is a tendency in the direction of hypothyroidism, then this will be detected by the hypothalamus. And if this happens, the hypothalamus will respond by releasing TRH, thyrotrophin releasing hormone. And this is the hormone that stimulates the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone. So when there's not enough thyroid hormone in the blood, the hypothalamus will release thyrotrophin releasing hormone, TRH. This will travel to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, this will cause the anterior lobe to produce more thyroid stimulating hormone. So the more TRH that arrives at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the more thyroid stimulating hormone the anterior lobe will produce. This thyroid stimulating hormone will circulate in the systemic blood to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It will stimulate the production of more thyroid hormone. When the thyroid gland produces more thyroid hormone, the levels of the thyroid hormone in the blood will increase. As we know, the hypothalamus is able to detect the levels of thyroid hormone in the blood that is passing through it. So when the levels of thyroid hormone in the blood are increased, this will also be detected by the hypothalamus. This will cause the hypothalamus to secrete less TRH, less thyrotrophin releasing hormone. This will cause the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to produce less thyroid stimulating hormone. If there's less thyroid stimulating hormone, this will cause the thyroid gland to produce less thyroid hormone, thereby lowering the levels of thyroid hormone back down towards the homeostatic ranges that are required. Over time, if the levels of thyroid hormone continue to drop, this will be detected by the hypothalamus. When the levels of thyroid hormone detected by the hypothalamus are too low, the hypothalamus will respond by producing TRH, causing production of more TSH, causing production of more TH. So the levels are homeostatically regulated. And this is actually referred to as a negative feedback system, because it is the end product, that is the thyroid hormone, that is inhibiting the release of its own initial releasing factor. Here we see an overview of the anatomy of the neck, and we notice the thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple. And the first ring of cartilage of the trachea is a complete ring of cartilage called the cricoid cartilage. And between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage is the cricothyroid ligament. And then lower down at the bottom of the diagram, we notice the incomplete rings of cartilage maintaining the patency of the trachea. And we notice the position of the thyroid gland, and the 4 parathyroid glands are actually embedded in the tissue of the thyroid gland, in fact towards the back of the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is in much the same position that we might wear a bow tie. Now this cricothyroid ligament is very important in emergency care, because if you feel the first cartilage in the neck, that's the thyroid cartilage, the uppermost, and then you can feel a second smaller one below that, and the second smaller one that you can feel below that is the cricoid cartilage, and between the two there's a little gap where you can feel the cricothyroid ligament. Actually, you can't really feel it. All you do is feel the gap between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. And in emergency care, sometimes it's necessary to form a tracheostomy, an opening into the trachea through the cricothyroid ligament, a cricothyroidotomy, or a cricothyroid tracheostomy, an opening into the trachea through the cricothyroid ligament. And if you do go through this cricothyroid ligament, through the center, there should be very little bleeding because you're avoiding the vascular thyroid gland. And the trachea at this point is remarkably superficial. So a tracheostomy tube can be passed into the top of the trachea, giving us an airway to maintain an airway in certain emergency situations.
Well, this model is showing us some of the anatomical relationships of the thyroid gland and something of the blood supply. You can see the internal jugular veins in dark blue on the outside, and then going in, the red lines we can see are the carotid arteries, and the blue shield-shaped component is the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. And the little white line you can see below that is the cricothyroid ligament, which sometimes needs to be penetrated in emergency situations to get an airway. And then in light speckled brown, we've got the thyroid gland. We've got the inferior thyroid vein draining from the bottom of it, although in real anatomy there's a middle and a superior thyroid vein as well. But this inferior thyroid vein, if we could see further down, would drain into the left brachiocephalic vein, which in turn drains into the superior vena cava. And likewise, we can see something of the arterial supply of the thyroid gland. The superior thyroid artery, normally it derives actually from the external carotid artery, although in this model it looks more like it's deriving from the common carotid artery. But nevertheless, there's an arterial blood supply going in, and there's also an inferior thyroid artery as well. And of course, endocrine glands are well perfused with blood because the endocrine product goes directly from the gland where it is produced directly into the blood circulating through the gland. Therefore, the product goes directly into the systemic circulation for systemic absorption. Well, here we're looking at some more anatomical arrangements of the thyroid gland. You can see the thyroid gland itself looking a bit like a bow tie with the lobes of the thyroid gland on each side and the central isthmus. And below that we can see the cartilaginous rings in the trachea. We notice the recurrent laryngeal nerves which have been pulled outwards that supply the larynx and control the voice. And interestingly, we also notice the vagus nerves here, the 10th cranial nerves, as they pass down the neck towards the heart and towards the gastrointestinal viscera. Now, in the thyroid gland, in addition to the cells that are producing the thyroid hormones, there's also some parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells are also called the C cells, and they lie between the follicles that produce the thyroid hormones. And the parafollicular cells produce a hormone called calcitonin. And calcitonin helps in the regulation of calcium homeostasis. And the more calcitonin there is in the blood, the lower plasma levels of calcium will become. Now, thyroid hormones are particularly important during fetal development and during childhood because they are essential for growth. Without adequate amounts of thyroid hormone, you will not get normal growth and the child will become stunted and short in stature. And as well as that, in fetal life, and especially in early childhood, but throughout childhood, brain development is dependent on the presence of adequate amounts of thyroid hormone. Therefore, if there's a deficiency of thyroid hormone for medical reasons, or if there's a deficiency of thyroid hormone because there's not enough iodine in the diet, this can result in pediatric hypothyroid syndrome, with stunted physical growth and stunted neurological and therefore mental development. And in the old days, we used to call this pediatric hypothyroid syndrome cretinism. Now, the thyroid gland, of course, is producing thyroid hormones. And there's two types of thyroid hormone. There's T3 and there's T4. T4 contains 4 atoms of iodine and T3 contains 3 atoms of iodine. And of course, iodine is an absolutely essential component of the thyroid hormones. Without the iodine, we're not going to get thyroid hormones and the patient will become deficient. So T4 is sometimes called tetraiodothyronine, that is T4, tetra for 4, and T3 is sometimes called triiodothyronine, that is T3. But the number denotes the number of iodine atoms in the molecule of thyroid hormone. And iodine is absolutely essential. It is impossible to make thyroid hormones without iodine. And thyroid hormone will control metabolic rate, influencing probably nearly all the cells in the body, if not all the cells in the body. So the greater the amount of thyroid hormone in the blood, all the cells of the body are going to metabolize at a faster rate. It's going to stimulate metabolic processes. But conversely, if the level of thyroid hormone is lower, then the metabolic rate in virtually all the cells in the body will also be reduced. So the thyroid hormone is controlling the degree at which body cells are producing energy. Number 1 on this microscopic slide of thyroid tissue is actually inside the thyroid follicle. And the thyroid follicle, the number 1 here, you can see it's pinkish stained, is thyroglobulin. And the thyroglobulin is produced by number 2, which is the follicular cells, which surround the thyroid follicles. So the follicular cells are producing thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is a colloid. And the thyroglobulin contains the thyroid hormones themselves and proteins in which they are stored prior to their release. And in life, the thyroglobulin would fill the thyroid follicle. It's just like retracted back a bit during the preparation of this slide. And 3 are the parafollicular cells, or the C cells, which, as you probably recall, produce calcitonin. Now, the reason they're called C cells is they were originally called the clear cells because they are very light staining on micrograph preparations. So they're C cells or clear cells or parafollicular cells producing the calcitonin in between the follicular cells producing the thyroid hormone, which goes into the thyroid follicles and is stored in the form of thyroglobulin. Now, at the back of the thyroid gland, 4 small parathyroid glands are embedded into the thyroid tissue, although this is succinct, histologically different tissue. And there are normally 4 of these very small parathyroid glands. They only weigh about 40 milligrams each, but they're very important because they produce parathyroid hormone or parathormone. And parathyroid hormone is vital because it increases the plasma levels of calcium. So when you have more parathyroid hormone, the amounts of calcium in the blood will rise. And of course, this is the converse of the calcitonin produced by the C cells, which had the effect of lowering serum calcium levels. So the parathyroid glands in the back of the thyroid gland producing parathyroid hormone to increase plasma levels of calcium. So as we carry on working our way down the body, the next gland we come across is the pancreas. And the pancreas is an endocrine and an exocrine gland. It's exocrine because it's going to produce digestive enzymes or proto-digestive enzymes, and these are going to go down this white structure in the center of the pancreas, the pancreatic duct, into the duodenum. And this curved tube here, labeled number 23 on this diagram, is the curve of the duodenum. And just above that you can see there's the liver, and you can see the tip of the gallbladder below the liver. So most of the tissue in the pancreas is exocrine, producing these digestive enzymes. But of course the pancreas also contains endocrine tissue. And this endocrine tissue in the pancreas is located within the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. Well, the endocrine tissue in the pancreas is located in over 1 million small pancreatic islets, which we see as the black dots here. But in reality, in a healthy pancreas, there's going to be over 1 million of them, the endocrine tissue. And we see that the pancreas is located in the curve of the duodenum. And this is in the upper abdomen. And the pancreas is quite posterior. It's behind the stomach. And actually on this diagram we can see the common bile duct bringing bile down, joining the pancreatic duct within the tissue of the pancreas and carrying the combination of bile and digestive enzymes out into the duodenum. But that's the exocrine function. So let's notice there's over 1 million in a healthy pancreas, endocrine pancreatic islets. This slide's just to give us a little more of the anatomical relationships of the pancreas. Now we can see above here the stomach has been peeled up because the pancreas is posterior to the stomach. And we can see that the head of the pancreas is in the curve of the duodenum, with the body of the pancreas going up and the tail of the pancreas going across to the left side, ending up roughly over the left kidney. And even further to the left, we notice we have the spleen. Now here we see 2 micrographs of individual pancreatic islets. And we notice the exocrine tissue around about the outside that produces the digestive enzymes. And we notice that there are a different type of looking cells in the pancreatic islets. And the main types of endocrine cells in the pancreatic islets are the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells tend to be round about the outside of the pancreatic islet, whereas the beta cells tend to be closer into the middle. So in a normal pancreas, remember, there will be over 1 million of these microscopic pancreatic islets. This is a simplified diagram of a single pancreatic islet. And as we would expect, because it's endocrine tissue, it's got a good blood supply. So blood is going to enter via the arteriole on the left. So here we're looking at a single pancreatic islet supplied with blood from an arteriole. And as this blood passes through the islets, it's going to pick up the endocrine hormones produced and secreted by the islet cells. And the blood's then going to return to the systemic venous circulation via the venules that we see on the right of this diagram. Now, the core of each pancreatic islet is more concentrated in beta cells, and these are sensitive to increases in blood glucose levels. So the beta cells detect an increase in blood glucose levels, and when this is detected, they respond by producing insulin. And the cortex contains the alpha cells, and the alpha cells are sensitive to falls in blood sugar levels. So if you like, the beta cells are hyperglycemia detectors, and the alpha cells are hypoglycemia detectors, detecting falls in blood glucose levels. And when the alpha cells detect falls in blood glucose levels, they're going to secrete another endocrine hormone called glucagon. So glucagon is produced by the alpha cells when the blood sugar levels, which way are they going to go? The alpha cells are going to detect it when the blood sugar levels go down. Well, this slide shows one of the actions of insulin. It's taking soluble molecules of glucose, which will be in the blood and the tissue fluids, and it's converting it into the polysaccharide called glycogen. And the glycogen is stored in insoluble form in the liver and in the muscles. So that means if the glucose is not in soluble form, it's no longer in the blood and tissue fluids, and therefore blood sugar levels have been reduced. Here we're looking at a second hypoglycemic mechanism of insulin. Insulin molecules acting as a signal are fitting into the insulin receptors, and this is facilitating the opening of the glucose gate, actually facilitated by glucose transporter molecules. But the key thing is the insulin is facilitating the passage of the glucose through the phospholipid cell membrane, which normally keeps the glucose out. So the glucose is getting from the blood and tissue fluid, where it's causing high blood sugar levels, into the cytosol of the cell, where the mitochondria are just waiting to utilize the glucose in the formation of energy. Here we see one of the actions of glucagon. When the blood sugar levels fall, that's going to be detected by the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets, and the alpha cells release glucagon. And the glucagon will take the glycogen, which has been stored in the liver and muscles, and it will break it down again into single monosaccharide units of glucose, which will then go into the blood and tissue fluids and will raise the level of glucose in the blood. So we see glucagon has a hyperglycemic effect as it converts glycogen to glucose. Here we see a microscope slide of a pancreatic islet, and it's been stained with the stain that is attracted to glucagon. And we can see that the glucagon is being produced in the pancreatic islet. Or at least from this slide we can see there's a lot of glucagon in the pancreatic islet. And we also know that the glucagon is in fact produced by the alpha cells in these pancreatic islets of Langerhans. Well, on the left we see a molecule of glucagon produced by the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets. And glucagon, like insulin, is described as a peptide hormone. This means it's a small protein. Now, if a patient is very hypoglycemic, we won't be able to give them anything to drink because they'll be unconscious and they won't be able to eat. And of course, it's vital that we don't try and give unconscious patients drinks because the fluid will go down into their lungs, causing aspiration pneumonia and potentially kill them. So sometimes when a patient is unconscious and hypoglycemic, if we don't have intravenous dextrose or intravenous glucose available, we can use glucagon. And we can give, perhaps 1 milligram would be an adult dose of glucagon. We can inject that intramuscularly, and that will reverse the hypoglycemia enough for the patient to wake up, we will hope. And then once the patient's awake, of course, we will give them some carbohydrate-based food and sugar-based food to eat to bring their blood sugar levels up further back to normal levels. The next endocrine glands we want to think about are the adrenal glands. Now, in the old days, these used to be called the suprarenal glands because they are above each kidney. So on this model, we can see the orangey structures, one above each kidney. These are the adrenal glands. This diagram shows a slice or a section of an adrenal gland. And first of all, we can see there's an area in the middle called the adrenal medulla. But outside that, there's 3 layers of adrenal cortex. And the outer layer of this adrenal cortex produces aldosterone. The middle layer produces hydrocortisone and other steroid-type hormones. And the inner layer of the cortex produces androgen, which of course is a male-type hormone. So 2 main layers of the adrenal gland, the medulla and the cortex, but the cortex subdivided into other layers that produce different endocrine hormones. Well, this rather nice micrograph shows the clear difference in the histology between the adrenal cortex and the inner adrenal medulla. Now, hydrocortisone is the main glucocorticoid produced by the adrenal cortex. And these hormones are called glucocorticoids because they're going to affect glucose and carbohydrate metabolism. Now, the functions of hydrocortisone are a bit complicated, but basically it increases the probability of survival if the body's in difficult situations. For example, one of the functions of hydrocortisone is to ensure that the body has enough available sources of energy to deal with times of stress. And this is why it increases the level of nutrients in the blood, such as amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose. And it can do this by mobilizing reserves, so that when we're in a difficult survival situation, we've got the nutrients that are required to carry on to allow us to be functional people and to fight and to run away as necessary. Now, hydrocortisone also increases the probability of survival by inhibiting the inflammatory process. Now, as you probably know, inflammation is the first stage of the wound healing process and is necessary for wound healing. But inflammation also causes pain, which may inhibit essential body movement and activity. Because hydrocortisone inhibits the inflammatory processes, it also inhibits pain. And this means that movement essential to survival can carry on, such as fighting a predator or running away. So these mechanisms explain why levels of hydrocortisone are increased during periods of stress and anxiety. Hydrocortisone and other related steroid compounds, of course, may be given in drugs as well. And steroids are very powerful anti-inflammatory drugs and will reduce pretty well any type of inflammation present in the body. The adrenal cortex also produces aldosterone or aldosterone, and this has the effect of increasing the reabsorption of sodium from the renal tubules. So more sodium is retained in the blood. So the more sodium that is reabsorbed, the lower the levels of sodium in the urine and the higher the levels of sodium are going to be in the blood. So the more aldosterone released by the adrenal cortex, the higher the plasma levels of sodium will be. And as sodium is an osmotic molecule, it will attract more water into the blood. And this will increase overall blood volume and so will have the effect of increasing blood pressure. And in a survival situation, this is also very useful because a survival situation might involve the loss of blood if someone's been in a fight, for example, and they've lost some blood. But if the blood pressure is maintained, they're more likely to be able to take effective action for longer, thereby improving the probability of the individual's survival. Adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine, and noradrenaline is the same thing as norepinephrine. And these are both released from the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland. And collectively, these two hormones, the adrenaline and the noradrenaline, are known as the catecholamines. And adrenaline will prepare the body for fight or flight. It will increase heart rate and force of cardiac contractions, that is the stroke volume. And it will dilate the bronchial passages to let more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide out. And blood supply to the skin and gut will be reduced by vasoconstriction to leave more blood for the skeletal muscles, the heart and the lungs. And this is why someone looks pale if they're frightened, because the adrenaline will cause the peripheral vasoconstriction. And adrenaline will also dilate the pupils of the eye to increase light entry, so we can see effectively for the fight or flight situation. And adrenaline even prepares the body for possible injuries and blood loss, because it constricts the peripheral blood vessels. And that means that if a person is injured, they're going to bleed less because the blood vessels are already partly constricted. And it will also cause the blood to clot more quickly. So, preparing the body for emergency action. And the effects of adrenaline start just a few seconds after the hormone is released. And this means the body can be placed on an emergency footing as soon as danger is detected. Well, the prime function of the kidneys, of course, are to remove impurities and excess water from the blood and incorporate these into urine. But the kidneys also have endocrine functions. And two hormones are produced by the kidney, erythropoietin and calcitrol. And the kidneys also produce an enzyme called renin. And this is produced by the kidneys as part of the renin-angiotensin mechanism. Well, the kidneys are able to detect the amount of oxygen going through the kidney. And if the amount of oxygen drops, the kidneys will release an endocrine hormone called erythropoietin. And this will circulate to the red bone marrow and increase the production of erythrocytes. That's the process of erythropoiesis. So erythropoietin will stimulate the production of erythrocytes. And of course, it's the erythrocytes that carry oxygen. They are the red cells. So when the number of red cells in the blood is increased, the blood will carry more oxygen. Then the kidneys are able to detect this increase in the amount of oxygen in the blood, and they're therefore able to reduce the amount of erythropoietin that they produce. Therefore, less red blood cells will be produced in the process of erythropoiesis by the red bone marrow. And in this way, by turning on and turning off the production of erythropoietin, the kidneys are able to regulate the mass of red cells in the circulation at any one time. So we want enough, so enough oxygen is carried, but we don't want too many, so the blood doesn't become too thick. And this is precisely controlled by the kidney detecting the amount of oxygen and therefore regulating the secretion of erythropoietin. Now, the second endocrine hormone produced by the kidneys is calcitrol. And this is in fact the active form of vitamin D. Now, the forms of vitamin D produced by the skin when it's exposed to sunlight and that we get from our food, this form of vitamin D is relatively physiologically inactive. And the body can't really use these forms until they've been activated by the kidney. And calcitrol is classified as a hormone because it is produced in the body from chemical precursors and then it's transported in the blood to target tissues. So it's the kidneys that are activating vitamin D, making it useful vitamin D, and we call this activated form of useful vitamin D calcitrol. And loss of this ability to convert vitamin D into the active form explains why patients with chronic renal failure lose bone mass, because vitamin D, of course, is essential for normal bone and calcium metabolism. Now, gonads is a collective term for the ovaries and the testes. And on this diagram, we can see the vagina at the bottom, then the uterus above that, the uterine tubes, and connected to the uterine tubes on the ends, on the sides of this picture, we see the ovaries. So gonads means the ovaries and the testes. And the ovaries are located in the female pelvis, and the testes are located in the scrotal sac. And ovaries are responsible for the development and release of the ova. And they also produce two main hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And the testes produce sperm and the principal male sex hormone, which is called testosterone. So estrogen and progesterone are the main hormones produced by the ovaries. And these are both steroid type hormones. They're not proteins, and they're actually synthesized from cholesterol. Now, the levels of estrogen production are highest during the first 14 days of an idealized menstrual cycle, and it's the estrogen which builds up the tissues and vascularity of the endometrium in case implantation should take place. But during the second half of a menstrual cycle, in an idealized 28-day cycle, that will be days 14 to days 28, the progesterone is mostly produced by the corpus luteum. And it's the progesterone produced by the corpus luteum in the ovary which maintains the endometrium in case implantation should occur. So one way to think of this is estrogen is the developing hormone and progesterone is the maintaining hormone. The testes, of course, produce the male gametes, the sperm, in very small seminiferous tubules. Once produced, the sperm are stored and mature in the epididymis prior to leaving the testis via the vas deferens prior to ejaculation. But in between all these tubular structures, they are the interstitial cells of Leydig. And these produce several androgens, several male-type hormones. But the most abundant one of these is testosterone. At puberty, testosterone and sperm production are stimulated under the influence of the anterior pituitary gonadotrophic hormone. That is luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. So the two gonadotrophic hormones are luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. Now in men, follicular stimulating hormone stimulates spermatogenesis, the formation of the sperm. And luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone secretion. So the more luteinizing hormone, the higher the levels of testosterone will be. And despite these different functions in men, these two hormones remain or retain their names based on what they do in female physiology. And after puberty, testosterone levels remain high up until the age of about 50, when they start to gradually decline. And it is the testosterone which is responsible for the development of male secondary sexual characteristics. Now, it's actually the testosterone which is responsible for the existence of the male sex, because in fetal life, the Y chromosome causes the early genital tissue to produce testosterone. And if this stimulation from the Y chromosome does not occur, a baby girl will develop, because of course girls don't have a Y chromosome. And it's this fetal testosterone which causes the development of the penis, prostate gland, seminal vesicles, the male genital ducts and scrotum, as well as other male body characteristics. And testosterone also causes the testes to descend into the scrotum in later fetal life. And from shortly after birth and throughout boyhood, the levels of testosterone will remain fairly low in the blood. But with puberty, testosterone production is increased, and this will stimulate the enlargement of the primary male sexual organs and the development of the male sexual characteristics, such as needing to shave and breaking the voice breaking and becoming deeper, and development of muscles.